our presentations for today. Has anyone not been able to get onto the Slack app? You all figured that out? Or any lingering questions? Let me just ask that. Any lingering questions that we can address in class? We haven't been using it to communicate with you yet, really, but we want to make sure that you're able to get on. Okay, how many of you have made an account and have access to our site? Okay, that's pretty good. How many of you have actually tried using it yet? Okay, for what purposes?
For our group.
For your group? Sweet. So you've been able to group message each other? Excellent. Any other uses so far? Okay. You had an announcement or two.
Yes, yeah. So two quick things. First of all, a couple of people have asked me how the reading's going to be reported, since it is a significant part of the credit for this particular course, our little 1-hour prep course. We're just going to send around a self-reporting kind of sheet at the end of our time. So you aren't going to do it sort of time by time, but you will get to do it. And at least on my side, if you do the reading during this semester, that's good. So I would prefer, of course, that you had it all done before class, but I think a few of you were surprised by just how much of a slog it was through the Norton intros. So that's something that you can kind of go back and finish up if you need to. The other thing is, Jordan's going to be going through and looking to see if everyone's flight itineraries and things like that are entered in online. That's just the same place that you filled out your application. So you can go in there and put in your info. If that's not up to date, or if you haven't made, if you haven't made bookings, you don't have the information yet. But as soon as you do, please put it in there. And based on that, we're going to ask her to compile some information about when people are arriving in London and things like that, so that if we happen to have half a dozen people that are all coming to the same airport around the same time, we can let you guys know. And if you want to make plans to get to the London Center together or whatever, you can do that. So just go in and update everything as you have information available.
Thank you. Any questions on flights and dates and those kinds of things, logistics that you're starting to think through? Okay, I stopped by the Kennedy Center ISP office today, and I got word that if you are up to date on your finances, which means you paid your $500 deposit and then you paid your $1,000, which was due in early March, you are now eligible to pick up a backpack. What you can also pick up, because it's all ready for you, is you can pick up your customs letter that you're supposed to bring with you on your flight, and an ID card that will get you into the London Center. You don't need those for a little while, but they are available for you. And if you are up to date financially, you can pick up a backpack. And if you haven't done this before, you go into the door of the Kennedy Center that is the closest door to the Wilkinson Center and the library, that corner of the Kennedy Center. And you just go straight down the stairs, and on the left is the office, where you can go pick up your backpack and that you can choose from something like 7 different styles. You're welcome to do that. Do you want to make sure people don't pick up the same backpack as you?
No, I was just whispering to my daughter, that's why people go. Everyone just wants the really cool pack. One other announcement I put up on our Learning Suite page today, this is the last week to apply for humanities college funding. If you happen to be majoring or minoring in anything humanities, they have money for you, and it's really easy to apply for it, but they do cut that off March 29th.
Thank you for doing that. Also, you should all have received an email asking you to fill out a survey about church attendance, so languages you speak, things like that. I can't remember, when do you need to have that filled out by? Anyone know?
Seems like they just said the sooner the better.
Fill it out this week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, the church.
Yeah, the church survey.
Yeah.
Yeah? Have you done it?
Yeah, I did it.
Sweet. Good luck getting the award you want.
I think I will get it. Yeah. Mandarin award, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Yeah, you think
Hope
so?
so.
Okay.
Pretty confident.
don't know, mission calls don't work that way.
I don't know.
We had a missionary speak in my ward yesterday, who was the only missionary to get called from his stake in like 3 years. So when he opened his call, everybody like in the stake had a big party for him. Remember, they were so excited, and they all huddled around, and it was like a big stake event, like first missionary heading out into the wide world, you know, in 3 years, and he got called to Orem, Utah. Highest baptizing English-speaking mission in the church, so.
Yeah, we love Orem.
It is the kind of mission where you just teach and teach and teach and teach. It's kind of fun. Anyway, could be the same for you. You might think you're going Mandarin.
Yeah. They better not put me like a Spanish one.
Maybe they'll just send you back here. All right. I would like to invite McKenna, Emily, Sophie, and Stuart to come on up. I've got your slides up and running, and we'd love to hear from you. I'm dying to know what you're going to say because I can't summarize British history in 10 minutes. So.
Oh, really?
Awesome. Okay, so we're doing highlights of modern British history. I'm McKenna.
I'm Emily.
I'm Stuart.
I'm Sophie.
Okay, so the Battle of Waterloo started on June 18th of 1815, and it's where British, Dutch, Belgian, and German soldiers all came together to go against Napoleon's forces. This battle was pretty big. It it marked the end of the
Napoleonic.
Thank you. Wars, where 5 million people were killed. So it's still kind of important because it was two great military leaders who were fighting against each other, and that was Wellington and Napoleon. It also achieved the lasting peace in Europe, even though it was a huge bloodshed war and so many people were killed and it was so awful. And also, I read something where it said that Wellington told all his soldiers, like, if you'll fight and you'll stand up against these people and do it, I promise, I guarantee you peace. And they got it, and it said the legacy of Waterloo, the battle of it, helped in the development of the British Empire. It said it was instantly worthy of celebration. So even though it was so bad, they were able to celebrate that they came out of it.
Alright, so I found when I was doing my research that the Industrial Revolution was like really big in Britain, and it was like really impactful. So urbanization was really big, where like everyone started to migrate to the urban centers where the employment and the jobs were, and they were like leaving behind the countrysides and the agricultural workforce and all of that. And they were really big in the innovations, like all the scientific inventions that were really big actually started in England and then were shipped over to America and other European countries. But what I found to be like really interesting and impactful during the Industrial Revolution was the social and political changes that was brought. And the social changes was like women and children were forced to go work in the factories and they were very mistreated and exploited, but they were also leaving like the agricultural and the family and the home lifestyle behind. And what was really interesting as well was like the contrast between the rich and the working class. The rich industrialists were like dominating, like accumulating all the wealth, while the working classes were in like terrible, overcrowded, horrible conditions where they were like working like 15 to 18 hours a day, which brought like the political upheaval and the political changes of like labor laws and labor rights and social welfare education, which brought the Great Reform Act of 1832, which basically helped and changed the voting qualifications that like made the working class people be able to vote. And it brought like more cities were now involved like in parliament, and they were seen as valid and able to vote, which was really interesting and like impactful still today.
So going off of the Industrial Revolution, we have the
Victorian era, characterized by Queen Victoria, who played a very big part, because it's her era essentially. It's marked by a more popular opinion towards the monarchy. Before post-Queen Victoria, we have a large anti-monarchical sentiment in the British Empire. We see that because they felt like there was a strong disconnect between monarch and people. We see when Queen Victoria was coronated and married Prince Albert, after a couple of years they started doing a bunch of reforms, being more public in their dealings with their people. We see them riding in open carriages. We see them going to public works, participating in that, donating a lot of money to increase favor of the monarch. Because of that, like when she was riding in these open carriages, she actually got shot at a couple of times because she was so, I want to say vulnerable with people, which was kind of cool. So she also becomes the Empress of India, which also kind of dictates a lot of British foreign policy at the time. They become involved heavily in Egypt because they see Egypt as a way to getting more to the jewel of the empire, India. By becoming Empress of India, it shows the British ideals of imperialism, colonialism, and their big role that they played in the world. The British Empire was the largest empire in the world. The sun never set on the British Empire, which is very indicative of their growth and size. But with the leadership of Queen Victoria, they were able to make India their jewel. She was the longest reigning monarch before Queen Elizabeth II, as marked by the Golden Jubilee, which kind of highlighted their role in the world. It showed their might, both militarily, colonial, imperialistically. And then 10 years later, it was marked by the Diamond Jubilee, which showed the more technological aspect of the British Empire in the world, which was marked when she sent like a telegram around the world that's like, hey, I'm your queen, grateful for you guys. And then, kind of pressured them. And then when she died, that marked the end of the Victorian era and led us into the modern era.
Okay, so at the end, so a few years after the death of Queen Victoria, England and Britain became part of World War I, which was 1914 to 1918. 900,000 British soldiers were killed and 1.2 million were wounded. And it was said to have kind of destroyed the glory of the Victorian era, and because it brought about a time of economic downfall for them. They were in debt to the United States, which kind of, in a way, allowed the United States to kind of take over economically as a world power. In 1907 was when Britain joined an alliance with France and Russia, when they saw kind of the threat that Germany was becoming as a world power, because part of their mission was to maintain balance within Europe and stay a world power, so that's why they joined that alliance. Britain got actually involved in the war for several reasons. Two of the main ones were the threat of rivaling empires, and then also protecting the trade routes to India. And then the invasion of Belgium was what caused Britain to officially declare war because of the, let's see, what was it called? The Treaty of London, which they promised to protect Belgium should they be invaded, and then the conclusion of the war kind of marked the end of the dominance of the British Empire.
So I'm a little bit biased. I'm a Middle East Studies Arabic major, so I really like kind of seeing how the world interacts with the Middle East. And I feel like the British involvement in the Middle East is one of their biggest events that had a lot of repercussions in the modern era. We see that with the three agreements, the McMahon-Hussein, the Sykes-Picot, and the Balfour Declaration. Initially with the McMahon-Hussein agreement, it's between a British individual and the Sharif of Mecca, and his name is Hussein. The British promised the Arabs in the region that they would have a national homeland because of their involvement in World War I, usurping the Ottoman Empire. So when the question of the Ottoman Empire came into play, Britain wanted someone to kind of act as a proxy individual to help establish their dominance in the region, to maintain their roots to India. That was their ultimate goal. Then with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and a year later, we see the British, the French, and the Russians all getting together and having a secret agreement essentially between them all to divide up, or to do what to do with the Middle East after the First World War. They essentially agreed that they're going to cut it up in all these different ways, as seen as this like cool little graph, like spheres of influence. But the British and French kind of go hand in hand, and then the Russian diplomat that was involved, he backed out because of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia kind of puts a damper on international relations. So then we have the disclosure of this agreement by Vladimir Lenin that kind of turns public opinion against the British Empire, the French empires, and their dealings in secret that kind of aren't so ethical, I want to say. And then in 1917, the British Lord Balfour comes out with the Balfour Declaration that says the British monarchy supports the establishment of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, that region. And one of the speculations around this agreement is that the British did this in order to gain support for the Jewish population, from the Jewish population in America, to help them in their war involvement, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, that's what I think was important.
Okay, and then after that, there was World War II. On September 3rd, 1939, that's when Britain officially declared war on Germany after they invaded Poland. The Battle of Britain was one of the major turning points within World War II, and it was an air battle between the Allied powers and Nazi Germany, and it was the first major loss that Germany took in the war. Throughout World War II, the United Kingdom suffered a lot of bomb attacks. They called them the Blitz, and it was basically every night German planes would come over and bomb the city, and so that changed London a lot itself. In 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister and led the Commonwealth throughout the duration of the war, and in 1945, the Allied powers defeated Nazi Germany, but the British Empire as a whole, which also included soldiers from their colonies, like from India, Middle East, and different places, had 47,760,000 casualties in total.
And then to kind of go on with Winston Churchill, he served as the Prime Minister in the UK during World War II, and he also was voted the greatest Briton in history for everything he had done. He led them through the World War II, and he never gave up, never gave in to anything, even when it was so hard, and which led them to a victory. He also wrote so many books, which I think is what also made him such an amazing person, because he gave speeches, wrote books, and so many quotes came out of that. One that I liked was, "We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give." I like that because he was kind of born into a privileged life, but he literally gave his self to service and was very dedicated to it and wanted to do it all the time. And just one way he contributed to society was he initiated the Labor Exchanges Act of 1909, and that helped the unemployed people get jobs, so it's kind of a big deal.
And another political leader that was really influential was Margaret Thatcher. When I was doing my research on her, it was really amazing, how much stuff she was involved in and how much she changed the history of British. She was the first woman to be elected head of government in Europe, and she was elected the Prime Minister in the UK on May 4th, 1979. And she was actually the longest serving British Prime Minister in the 20th century. And still today, she's considered one of the greatest and influential politicians in British history, which is really interesting. And one of the two huge events that she was a part of that I felt was really influential was, one, she implemented the free market economy through privatization, which is basically taking key industries or companies that were publicly owned and switching them to privately owned. And so she was reducing government intervention by selling off these key industries that were owned by the government, because she wanted to lower prices and have better efficiency and more quality of service, because making these companies and industries more well-rounded was able to provide a better service for the civilians. And also, she was a huge part in the help of ending the Cold War, which was super cool. She was really close with President Ronald Reagan, who was also wanted to end the communism in Europe. And she was the one who figured out that if she negotiated with the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, that she could be, like, she was kind of like the soundboard between him and Ronald Reagan, and was able to figure out a way to overthrow the communism in Europe, and she successfully did that, and that was a huge part in helping at the end of the Cold War.
Some sources.
Thank you so much. All right, the Royalists, come on down. For some reason, on the presenter view, it seems like it kind of cuts it off just a little bit. But let's see. I'm gonna pull it back out like we did before, okay? So you can see that. Come on over.
Alright. Okay. Hi. We're going to be talking about British royalties. My name's Tabby.
I'm Sam.
I'm Shelby.
So with the royal dynasties, I put up some of like the more major of the different houses that ruled England. But there were many because England was a pretty wild place until now, really. And so there were different different nobles would constantly be fighting over the throne. But eventually, the House of Godwin, which was part of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, or like the latter part of it, during like different Viking raids, they were the ones that kind of unified what we see as modern England, so like the southern half of the big island, not Ireland, the other one, Great Britain. And so, and then the House of Tudor has like Henry VII, who took over later on after William the Conqueror, and he did it in a really sketchy way, and then his son, Henry VIII, was pretty sketchy too. But Queen Elizabeth was really powerful leader. One thing that I was reading about her that was really cool was she wouldn't marry because she knew that doing that would lose her throne. So she kept it there as the daughter of Henry VIII. And then there's that movie, Mary Queen of Scots, coming out. Shows kind of how Tudors kind of lived their life. So, and then the House of Hanover, King George III. We know about that from the American Revolution, and then House of Windsor is the modern day royal family. So. And then how the British royalty started. So during the 8th century, there was lots of different kingdoms going on, and Vikings would come in and raid, and eventually started setting up their own kingdoms. And so, and then eventually the Kingdom of Wessex, Alfred the Great declared himself king of all of the English. It wasn't quite yet, but then eventually his son was able to conquer all of that. And then the Normans came in from France with William the Conqueror, and they really established the Anglo-Norman, like what the British royalty would become. There was a period of time though during the 11th century where William the Conqueror's, all his heirs were constantly fighting for the throne, but eventually it became solidified, and then that's kind of where we get around the 12th century when it starts really coming into play to how it is now. So, and then kind of as far as what the British monarchs, what their powers were. At first they were all absolute monarchs, total power, you know. But as William the Conqueror came in and feudalism started to really set in, different lords started to have power in like a more pastoral setting, and then that led to the Magna Carta, where several barons got together in 1215, and they tried to strip the king of some of his powers. That fell apart pretty quickly, but then got reinstated at the end of the 13th century in order to get the lords to obey the king a little bit more, gave back some of those powers. And then different things like the English Bill of Rights came into play over time that slowly gave power to back to the people, or back, and until today, where all of the monarchy, they mostly just go out and do service and other things, but they don't have any political power at least that they claim to have. And so that now Parliament does, and the Prime Minister does all of those kind of things, so.
All right, so this is the current royal family. The Queen is Queen Elizabeth II, and she'll be the longest. She's the longest reigning monarch after Victoria, or since Victoria, and this year it's like 67 years since she's been coronated. She was coronated in 1952 after the death of her father, King George IV. That's how her name was. If Queen Elizabeth ever dies, who knows? Then Charles will become king, unless she outlives him, and then William will become king, because I'm convinced that Queen Elizabeth is immortal. And so, yeah, there's them. So like he said, the royal family doesn't really have a political or executive role anymore. The Queen is really just like a ceremonial head of state, and the ability to make and pass legislation is completely, not completely, but like held by Parliament and the Prime Minister. They're the ones that do that. So the royal family is really just public figures, and I'm obsessed with them. And so they act as a focus for like national identity and unity, like and pride, like what it means to be British. They give a sense of stability and continuity and like, society, there we go. They support the idea of voluntary service, and they're really involved in charity. I read there's like 3,000 different charities that call a member of the royal family their head, or like on their like board of important people.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about how the British people actually feel about the royal family. So for the most part, they love them. It kind of goes with the idea of traditional British society. They like the traditional family, and a lot of it is that they think they work really hard. So like here she is, Kate Middleton, digging some dirt, I think. So, like they work really hard. So they hold them really high, and they're just part of British society, making a big part of British pride and stuff. So you can go to the next slide. So yeah, people love them outside of Britain too. Obviously, America loves them. For the wedding that was most recent, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Okay, thanks. I didn't watch it. But 29 people watched it, which topped the wedding of Kate Middleton, which was 22.8 million. So that's pretty big deal. And even Princess Diana, when she died in '97, about 2 billion people watched it, which is kind of a big deal considering it was in the 90s especially. You know, you had to have cable or something. So yeah, and these events, like, people watch them at like 5 in the morning here. So people really like the British family and following them. And then there are some people who don't love the British family in Britain. So about 15 to 20% of the population think that they should abolish the monarchy. This group is called Republicans. So they want to get rid of the monarchy and kind of form a republic instead. Their big issues with the monarchy is that they believe it kind of reinforces classes, because the royal family is born into their power. So it reinforces the idea that you're kind of stuck where you're born into, which is kind of, I don't know, it has a good argument, but I don't know. People are really obsessed with the royal family, so I don't think this will gain much traction. But anyways, that's about it.
All right. Thank you. Those are both really thoughtful and fun to see what you guys came up with. Let's just do a quick poll. How many of you are into the British royal family? Raise your hand.
How many what?
Like you follow them,
Oh,
like
I
you're
follow
interested in their
them. I
news.
follow them for web address.
All right, Jane, why?
Why?
Yeah, tell me why.
Well, to be totally honest, I watched Will and Kate's wedding. We woke up at 2 a.m. and we had
Okay.
we had tea and we made like little hats. So that's fine. And then I also watched Meghan Markle and Harry's wedding too. I just like it.
The
I
preacher
don't
was
know.
amazing.
They're just like, I just feel like they're like, maybe it's like what we long for in America with this
They're
broken
just, like,
political
no
system.
American
You just like
poetry.
love, they're like good people, you know?
Fascinating.
Yeah, she gets it. And they're lovely.
Is there anybody who just doesn't get it? Like, yeah. What are your questions?
Are they good people? I mean, Harry kind of had a sketchy background.
Yeah,
from what I
they
understand.
Not everybody is perfect.
We'll spend 3 weeks on Prince Harry over the course of the summer.
Yeah.
Try to answer that question. I've got a hard copy of the syllabus. We're going to spend some time introducing one of our courses this summer, the British History and Politics course. This syllabus is also online in Learning Suite. So if you're not interested in having a hard copy, you don't need to take one. But it might be helpful for you for reference. If you go into Learning Suite under the Content tab, you'll see the syllabus posted there as well. It's not actually under the syllabus tab, it's under the Content tab. But it's available. Some of you have had some questions and approached me wanting to take the cross-listed course, Poly 351, which is called, it's actually British Government and Politics, is I think what it's called. And that will be available. It's if you would prefer to register for that one instead of European Studies 336R, you can do that. I went up before this class to check and see if it's available in the system yet, and they think it will be probably tomorrow. So that's an option for you. The only requirement is that if you take that class, I'm going to ask you to purchase one additional book, from which the rest of us are going to be reading selections. But I'm going to ask those of you enrolled in 351 to read the whole book, which is a more comprehensive effect of British politics. It's not a lot of additional work, but it will help round out some of your government education that I think is critical to get credit for the 351. So I will talk through that here in a moment. All right. I mentioned this at the very beginning, but we can't study all of British history and all of British politics in the time that we have together. So I pulled out 3 themes that we're going to really focus in on. Those are empire, war, and democracy. And we will be spending a decent amount of time on each of those. Do you need a syllabus, Aaron? Do you have a copy on your?
I'm looking at it here.
Okay, great. And as I mentioned before, one way that we're going to get access to that is by doing a case study of Winston Churchill, who was a great champion of the British Empire, a great champion of British war, and a great champion of British democracy. All 3 were major themes in his life. And so you can see some of the learning outcomes that we've developed for this class. It's really a mixture of a history and a social science course, which is kind of a heavy lift with just a little bit of time, but I'm going to do my best to help weave those things together. So there are 3 required books. I've mentioned one before because you should have done some reading from one of them for today. And that's Lawrence James, The Rise and Fall of the British Empire. I don't want to scare you, but this is what the hard copy looks like. So if you order the hard copy, this is what you have to take with you in your suitcase. The digital copy is only about this thick. So it's not so bad. The other 2 books are much less intimidating in their physical appearance. So we're reading probably the thinnest of the Churchill biographies. He has some biographies that are over 1,000 pages, but this one is a pretty good thin version. And then the thinnest of the British politics textbooks, which is this. All right. And so those are the 3 books that you will need to purchase, and they're all available as digital downloads on Kindle, for example, if you'd like to do that. None of them are particularly expensive either. And then I'm going to be putting up on our Course Learning Suite website a variety of other PDF files for you to look at. And they come from 4 sources. So we're going to be reading a lot of Winston Churchill speeches, which are primary documents. We're going to essentially be walking through a lot of these events as he sees them in real time. And then I have a number of chapters from a Bill Jones textbook on British politics. That's the one that I'm going to ask people who are enrolling in Poly 357 to purchase. That's also available as a digital download, and it's not very expensive. But I'd like you to read the entirety of that book if you're enrolled in that section. I have some sections from John Keegan's The Second World War, which we will read from during the World War II pieces, and then I have some economist articles analyzing contemporary British politics that we'll read at the very end of the course that will be put up on Learning Suite as well. So if you do not need to buy any of those books, right? We are allowed to copy and put online up to 20% of a book without charging you for it. And so I'm keeping the page limit to less than 20% of each of those books so that we can do that without charge. And those will be put up on Learning Suite. Okay, I'd like to walk through some of the requirements. There is a little bit more writing, at least formal writing for this course than in the English course. The first writing assignment is actually due the Friday, the first week in London. And I will give you the prompt for that writing assignment at the end of class in April 15th in this course. Which means that if you would like, you can essentially write that assignment even before you arrive in London if you would like to do that. But you will have a week to do it once you're there. And that is an essay. It's called the Imperial Foundations Essay. Basic idea of that essay is that you will assess the rise and development of the British Empire prior to the 20th century, which we're going to start on today. It's limited to 5 pages, double-spaced, and I'll give you an essay prompt to answer that. And your main source for dealing with that will be the Lawrence James book that you're starting for today. There will be a second essay for this course that's due near the end of July, which is called the Britain at War essay, where you will assess Britain's role in World War I and World War II, including its successes and failures in those conflicts. And you can use a variety of resources from the syllabus on that. Both of these are open book, open note, but you're required to do your own work. These are not group assignments. We're going to be reading quite a few Churchill speeches, and Churchill is one of the great orators in the English language. He was also a master of persuasive rhetoric. And once you read enough of him, you'll start to get a feel for what Churchill sounds like and how he would approach a given topic. And so at the end of July, Monday, July 29th, you have an assignment to actually voice record a up to 5-minute persuasive oration in Churchillian style on any topic of your choice. So you can, anything that you feel excited about. It doesn't have to be about Britain or British history or world wars. It can be about, your love for wiener dogs or whatever kind of weird thing you've got going. I gave this assignment once, and one of the most amazing Churchillian speeches I've ever heard was about why orange is the best color. We'll talk more about that when we get there, but the main thing to do to get ready for this is just to read all these Churchill speeches so you get a sense of how he structures a persuasive argument, right? And I think you'll start to get into his voice. And so you don't have to write that one down, at least to submit to me, but you will write it down in a way that will allow you to deliver it, and then you will send me a voice memo. And we will probably pick a selection of those as well for some Churchillian performances. For those of you who are particularly interested in persuading the broader group, we'll give you a chance to try that. There is a British democracy assignment due near the end of the course. I'm going to give you a spreadsheet that essentially asks you to assess the current state of debate on 15 political issues in Britain. And you're going to write a short statement on those, and then you're going to write a short statement on how you feel personally about that issue and why. In other words, we're going to try to turn you into an informed British citizen, even though most of you are never going to vote in Britain. We want you to be able to, just in case, emergencies. All right. And so by the end of the summer, we hope that you are in a position where you have a good sense of what people are talking about in British politics and where you come down on those political issues. And I hope that that will also help you become more able to engage on the issues in whatever political context you find yourself, in the United States or otherwise. There are, as I alluded to on the first day of class, 3 short field assignments that are staggered throughout the semester. What these essentially are is I'm going to give you a short interview guide with 3 or 4 questions, and you're going to take a couple of your buddies and you're going to run around and ask people these questions and record their answers. And we are going to gather data together based on our interactions with British society on 3 topics. So one is British political issues, the most important issues, British political identities, and then perspectives on the role of Britain in Europe and in the broader world. So we're just going to collect information about what people in Britain are talking about as a great field exercise. And I think you'll have fun, because even if you find their answers tedious or uninteresting, you will get a chance to have real conversations with people that you otherwise wouldn't have. And I think you'll really enjoy that, even if you feel a little bit of trepidation when you do it. It's a lot easier than going on a mission, okay? Which many of you have already done. And then, as in the English class, there will be a course participation grade and a final exam. I'll try to keep to about 2 hours, and it'll largely be a short answer and maybe an essay exam that we'll have on the last day of class. Okay? So those are the assignments. If you look at the reading schedule, we're doing some British Empire foreground reading this week and next week. So this week you're supposed to have read the first 80 pages of the Lawrence James book, and then I've got 80 more pages for you to read for next Monday. And then sometime between April 1st and June 26th, this is on your own time, I'm going to ask you to read 9 more chapters in that book. Because those are the key chapters that you will need to have read and understand in order to write that first essay. So you can do that on your own time. Don't save it to the plane. You're going to be stressed and sleepy. You're going to be probably taking an overnight plane, and then you'll feel guilty that you didn't do your reading on the plane. Plus, there'll be good movies and stuff. So just find some time in your spring term to do that on your own time. And the reason for that is that when we arrive, we're going to jump right into the year 1900, and that's where we're going to be starting this course once we hit the ground in England. But there's a lot that goes on before 1900, and so I'm going to use today and next Monday to try to give you as much of that foundation as I can, but some of it will need to be on your own in terms of reading. This may feel to you like a fair number of assignments. I've tried to do the math to see how much work this will be for you, and if you read at an average student pace, not like falling asleep pace, but like an average student pace, you probably have 5 hours of reading for this course a week. Okay, and then in addition to class, you'll probably have about 3 hours to fulfill your other writing and various assignments. So I'm anticipating that in total you'll spend about 10 hours a week on this class. All right. I think we've baked enough space into the schedule to do that. If you just look at the reading schedule with me, you'll see a couple of notes. I put all of the assignments in here. All the things that say on Learning Suite in parentheses are on here as well. That's mostly Churchill speeches with some chapters on World War II and some chapters on British politics. I hope you'll enjoy it. I think it's good content. I tried to cut out the stuff that at least I don't find interesting, and I hope that you'll find some of that interesting as well. Let me open it up to questions. What questions do you have as you look over this in terms of expectations or assignments or reading?
Question.
Yeah.
Do you feel it would be detrimental to do the reading like earlier rather than waiting until we were in London to do it? Or do you think that then our memories would be foggy enough that it wouldn't be effective?
Well, you're welcome to do it earlier, but you just wanted to scribble on the margins or take notes or something. If you're reading it on device, you can highlight stuff easily. So it might be useful to have things to go back to refer to. All of the assignments for this course are open book, right, except for the final exam. And so what that means is that any notes you take, you would have access to when you sit down and do the writing. Other questions? Okay, here are my goals today, then. I'd like to give you a little lecture, and we can integrate some discussion to this lecture, about where the British state came from, and how we started to get the government that we got. And by the end of the course today, we're going to try to get through the 17th century. That will leave us on Monday to get to essentially work on developments in the 18th and 19th centuries, which are my main goals for next Monday. A few of you are political science majors, and this may not be a hard question for you, but for the rest of you, let's start with a very foundational question. What is a state in political terms? So not Utah as a state, but in comparative government, what does it mean to be a state?
Sovereign political entity.
Okay, so it's an entity. And what does sovereign mean?
Like they can make their own decisions and they're kind of in charge of their own affairs.
Yeah, the traditional definition is that they have control over a territory, right? So that they have control over the space within their borders. And what that often means is, in political science terms, is that they have a monopoly of violence in that territory. Which means, let's say a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence in that territory, which means that people think of the state as the ones allowed to have the weapons and the ones allowed to use force within that territory. There might be criminals, but they can be put in jail, right? There might be rebels, but they can be, repressed. But this idea that you have a political entity that can use violence to control its own territory is one of the foundational criteria of being a state, and that's often what we mean by being sovereign. States emerged in Europe at different times, but if you go back all the way to the medieval period, there were something like 1,500 states in Europe. Okay, and that might be hard to get your mind around. Right now there are about 48 maybe, or close to 50 if you include all the little ones. But when there were 1,500 states in Europe, what did a state look like back then, in the 1400s, for example? Feudal? What does that mean?
You kind of have like a landlord, I want to say, and then you have people that are working for you, working the land, providing labor for free, essentially, for protection, I guess.
Right. So a feudal system was part of it. What it usually looked like, it was a castle, and that castle had a lord, and that lord had some knights that were his agents of violence to go around the countryside doing whatever he needed them to do, and that he received resources from people who farmed agriculturally out around that castle. And in some places it was big enough to have a city wall. And that when someone else came to try to raid this domain, people would run into the city walls or run into the castle, and there would be food storage there, usually a year's supply. Maybe not quite. But there would be food storage, and there would be strategic access to water, and so raiders could come and they could burn the fields or whatever, but you could come and you could survive for a while. And if the raiders were particularly strong, they would lay siege to your castle. But that's hard. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of energy to lay siege to a tough castle. And so a medieval state in Europe was essentially a castle with knights and peasants, sometimes bound in a feudal relationship where they provided agricultural resources to the lord in exchange for protection. And it would expand out until it would bump into other states, and people would compete again over that territory, and then people would come back into that castle. And over the course of the medieval period, In Europe, there was what was largely known as survival of the fittest, okay, or political evolution, where if you were strong enough, you survived, and you could absorb other microstates, and you started expanding your territory, and if you didn't, you got absorbed. So when you think about the country that now is known as France, for example, it was not a cohesive country for a long period of time. It was a bunch of competing castles. But over time, people were able to accumulate loyalties. Sometimes they married into other royal families, which created alliances, and they started expanding territory. And this happened as well in Britain. And so in Britain there are all kinds of castles, right, that are remnants of this medieval period before there was broader state control. So there's a process in political science known as political development. And political development is the process by which institutions of governance start to evolve and grow. And an institution, to just be very clear, all an institution is a set of rules. But those have to be rules that are generally followed or held as acceptable. And so essentially the process of political development is the growth of acceptable rules of behavior and norms. And states crave institutions, right? Because they create loyalty to a particular set of rules, and then you don't have to force people to do things all the time, but people buy into a particular set of norms. So the ultimate political institution is a constitution, because the constitution says, here's the big picture, this is what we're about, here are the rules, this is who gets to do what, this is your role, citizen, in that political regime. And so constitutions are a formalization of political development. And we're going to talk a little bit today about political development. Now, there is, as well as political development, there is what is known as political decay. And political decay is the degradation of institutions and norms and rules. And sometimes it takes a long time for institutions to evolve, and it can take quite a short time for them to decay, because institutions are a combination of informal expectations and formal rules that are enforceable by law. Okay, so those are a few concepts, but now we're going to go back way before our history folks started and talk about some things that you might see as we travel around Britain. And I'd like to walk you through some of the major periods of history, so that when you go to the British Museum, for example, you're able to say, oh, okay, I can generally pinpoint when we're talking about here and what was going on. And one thing before we get there, we've already talked a little bit about geography, and you should know by now that Britain is an island. And islands have unique characteristics that might affect state development, right? So if you compare, say, Britain to Belgium, for example, Belgium is definitely not an island, and it doesn't have mountains either. What might you expect would be different in an island than in a country in continental Europe? Just because of the fact you're an island. Yeah, Adam?
A lot more defensible as far as influences, foreign influences. Like there's like a gap between you and the other guy.
Right. So you at least have warning that people are coming for you, because it takes them a while to cross the channel, right? And it requires a lot more resources to put a bunch of people in boats to go invade you. So in one sense, you should be a little bit more defensible. I think that's a predictable thing about islands, yes?
You have more concrete borders, because in continental Europe everything's kind of ambiguous, but on an island it's just water and land.
That's right. So your borders should not fluctuate nearly as much as France's should, for example. Okay, France's borders have had some challenges over time. So sovereignty, going back to this idea of sovereignty, which is the ability to control the space within your borders, should be theoretically easier with an island. Is there another comment?
I was just going to say, like, what your economy is based on, the type of jobs that people have.
Okay, how does that affect that?
Oh, well, just because there could be a lot more trade and a lot more, I was just thinking being like by the water, maybe that could affect it, but maybe not.
Okay, so if you happen to grow up with a pool in your backyard, you probably learned how to swim faster than your neighbor kids did, right? And it's a little bit the same with Britain. If you grew up surrounded by water, you probably learned how to make boats a little bit faster than, say, the Belgians did, right? Because it creates an incentive for you to get out there and explore, right? Or maybe to defend yourself. And so I think that is one thing that being an island does allow for, which is you're probably going to be the first kid to get the new boat, right? So you're going to be interested in that. And what's the advantage of being the first one in the neighborhood to have the boat?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Okay, you can get to them and you can bully them if you want. You can explore faster, right? You can take advantage of rapid transit, right? It's often faster to travel by sea than by land. So it gives you some strategic possibilities because of that island nature. Did you have a comment as well?
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine it would increase the difficulty of communication. Because in continental Europe, countries are so small and they're all close together, and then England is not as close.
So it should allow you a little bit more peace in theory, right? From other people harassing you or communicating with you. You might be a little bit less globalized in that sense because you have it's just harder to reach you. You might not be as in tune with the nearest fads as fast as people in continental Europe because you're just farther away, right? And in part that's true as well. And what that allows us to do is to think about Britain's history in terms of some big waves in ways that might not be quite as easy to do in continental Europe. And so I've done my best to categorize some of these in big waves. Probably the earliest things you're going to see in Britain come from what is known as Iron Age Britain. And does anyone know why they call it the Iron Age? Any guesses?
Trying to stab each other.
Yeah, they figured out how to make iron. And iron is hard, right? And it means that you have better weapons and better tools. And so it's a technological development. And in Iron Age Britain, Britain is primarily populated by Celts. And the origins of Celts are slightly mysterious, but the descendants of the Celts are still around. And we have Celtic-speaking peoples in Wales and in Scotland, and even in Ireland. There are different theories as to how Celts eventually got here. But we know by about 800 BC, we have a large population of Celts. And they were known in history by the people who traveled there and observed them as Britons. So this is the first time that we really have the concept of Britons. And we know that by DNA, we know that they migrated there from the mainland European continent at some point prior to 800 BC. And they did quite well because the Britons had access to good agricultural resources. And for this period in history, it's pretty hard to come up with a population of a couple million people in one place, but that's what they were able to do. So by the time of Christ, you had probably between 3 and 4 million people resident in the British Isles that were essentially able to support themselves based on rich agriculture. The land was quite good. There was sufficient water. And they also became a trading nation. They traded in salt. They were also quite well known for making of their weapons. And their religion was pagan. And sometimes some of you may have heard of the Druids. The Druids come from the Iron Age. And the Druids had a variety of rituals and ceremonies that sometimes were dedicated to pagan gods, sometimes they're dedicated to nature. And there's still evidence of that Druidic culture in Britain. But the big empire on the block is the Roman Empire, right? And it's, of course, centered in Rome. And the Roman Empire expanded. It's probably expanded too far, to the point where its borders were ultimately undefensible. But it led an invasion in 43 AD and captured large parts of the British Isles. It didn't make it all the way up to Scotland because there were barbarians there. It joined England and Wales into a Roman province called Britannia. They even developed a Roman god who was a goddess called Britannia, and this still has some symbolic resonance in Britain today. And Emperor Hadrian got so tired of being harassed by these ferocious people in the north that he built a giant wall all the way across the island to protect Britannia from Scottish tribespeople who would come down from the north. And it's called Hadrian's Wall. And I think we're going to have a chance to see it at least, right?
Yeah.
If not walk a section of it. I'm hoping we can.
Just out of the North Country, North or Lake District, heading up towards Scotland, we'll stop.
So I'm looking forward to that. Some people will try to walk all of Hadrian's Wall, though it would take you a couple of weeks probably to do it. So it's quite long. But it's like the Great Wall of Europe, right? It's not quite as big as the Great Wall of China, but it was the great Roman fortification to protect against the vicious Scots. This became pretty well integrated into the Roman Empire. People, if you were a Roman citizen, you were able to come and travel there, and there was a fair amount of trade. Christianity, as it became introduced into the Roman Empire, was gradually introduced. And today, you see a major legacy from the Roman period of largely infrastructure. So Romans were particularly good at water systems. They built aqueducts and roads. And ultimately, by the 5th century AD, you get some economic decline. There's archaeological evidence that a lot fewer things were being built. And you get barbarian invasions coming from the Scots, but also from the Scandinavians and from some Germanic tribes. And it ultimately ends the Roman presence in Europe. And that brings us now to the Anglo-Saxon period. The Anglo-Saxon period is a long period of British history. Angles and Saxons are two different tribal groups, and they both have Germanic origins. So they came from the center of continental Europe and invaded. These are some of the barbarians that helped to take down the Roman province of Britannia. And they left a huge legacy on Britain. One of the biggest legacies was actually linguistic. So half of the words in the English language today actually come from Anglo-Saxon. And so you might guess, because Britannia was a Roman province for so long, that English would be a Romance language, but it's not. It actually has much more Germanic roots because of this Anglo-Saxon period. And so a lot of the weirdness of English, right, the irregularities, the stuff that French speakers and Spanish speakers just can't figure out, comes from Anglo-Saxon linguistic heritage. And this is the first time we end up getting the idea of an English nation and a culture that seems separate from big empires like Rome and others really starts to develop. It seems to be relatively indigenous to this island. And the Anglo-Saxons adopted Christianity and essentially spread Christianity throughout the British Isles. Their main challenge was that they had their own barbarians that they had to fend off for many years, and they usually came from the north. They came from Norway, came from the Viking coastline up there that came down from the north, and they tried to fight them off. And this is the first time that we have good record, aside from the Roman political institutions, which we have record of how Roman provinces were governed, but the indigenous institutions essentially came out of a tradition of Germanic folk assemblies, and a king's council was introduced. It was known as the Witan in this period of time. And the role of the Witan was to counsel kings. So this was a monarchical political system, but to counsel kings on two things: on revenue, so how to get taxes, and what kind of new laws we needed to get introduced. And really interestingly, quite early, this King's Council decided to take upon itself the responsibility of approving new monarchs. So when a monarch was killed or died or stepped aside, they would try to intervene and say, we approve this new monarch. And monarchs usually, I guess if you're a disputed monarch, it's really helpful to have somebody who legitimizes your succession. But it's the first sign that we really have some sort of independent body that's trying to create checks and balances on the monarch. Okay, fast forward, and our royalists in our presentation today mentioned this invasion. 1066 becomes an important milestone in British history because it is the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. There's a guy who becomes known as William the Conqueror, right? He comes up from the continent in France, and he sees that there's a potential dispute in the kingship in England and decides to come and claim the throne for himself based on a relation, and succeeds. And he decides to turn Britain into a defensible place by building a whole network of castles and garrisons during the Norman period of time. The Normans come from Normandy. We're going to go to Normandy. So Normandy is just across the channel on the French side. And they were not very good to the common Anglo-Saxons. So one of the main things that they did is they tried to take all of the land away, tried to accumulate the land from the common people, and they were mostly successful in that, and so you had a huge refugee crisis as a result of the Norman invasion, and a bunch of Anglo-Saxons fled. But where do you flee? Right? The only real place to flee is to France. So you have these French invaders coming up from Normandy, invade, and you have a bunch of Anglo-Saxons that flee back across the channel, and they settle in western France, just on the west side of Normandy, in a place called Brittany. So today, if you go to western France, western coast of France, there's a province called Brittany, which is named Brittany in part because of these waves of Anglo-Saxon immigrants that came after the Norman invasion and brought a lot of English culture with them. Okay, and this was an interesting period because linguistically, people on the ground were still speaking Anglo-Saxon, which is also known as Old English. And the clergy, the legacy of the Catholic Church was that all of the clergy were speaking Latin, but the government was speaking French. And so some people would learn French so that they could get involved with the government and things like that, but it was a complicated linguistic. Not too long after the Norman conquest, you end up getting a series of long succession crises. And these crises were essentially trying to figure out who has the right to rule, which dynasties are going to endure. And for a period of about 20 years, there wasn't really a functioning government after the Norman conquest. But the monarchy that emerges from that is known as the House of Plantagenet, and they're actually from France. They take charge, and they're able to rule with still a lot of trouble, but for about 300 years in the middle of the Middle Ages. But they have family quarrels, and there are rival families within Plantagenet that are trying to take the throne away from each other, and they fight in a series of wars known as the Wars of the Roses. Because they come from France, right, they're trying to create an empire that includes Britain, but also France, and so they also fought over the right to rule France, the people on the ground in France. So there's a lot of back and forth across the channel between the House of Plantagenet and its wars in France. And there's what's known as the 100-Year War in the 14th and 15th centuries, battles those two centuries, that is essentially this House of Plantagenet crossing the channel, trying to assert control over large parts of France as well. We had the Tudor dynasty already referred to, but the Tudor dynasty is an important dynasty that comes out of these quarrels that ultimately is important because it stabilizes Britain. It stops, at least for a time, stops the Civil War and starts to centralize English power. And really the monarchy starts to accrue power into the state and try to wipe out all of the king's potential enemies. One thing I wanted to add here during this period of time, right at the end of the Tudor dynasty, there's a big rivalry between Britain and Spain. So Spain and Portugal were the two powers that got out into the sea first and started to colonize the world first. And they moved right into the New World, and Spain moved into the New World seeking gold and treasure, and Portugal followed quickly as well. Both of those have big maritime boundaries, so they're both important sea powers. And as Britain is rising up in terms of its own state influence, right? It's struggled with its civil wars and things, and starting to build up its navy, it starts bumping into Spain. And Spain is by far the more powerful navy. But through a series of wars and some fatal, costly mistakes on the Spanish part, the Spanish Armada is defeated, and you actually get Britain, which had the smaller navy at first, ultimately establishing dominance over the seas versus the Spanish. And this becomes a major turning point in the potential for British colonization, because prior to that, it had largely been blocked out by much bigger rivals in Spain and Portugal. So this is why Latin America all speak Spanish and Portuguese, right? Is because Britain was just kind of diddling around, like fighting wars of the roses and stuff. Sure, you know, they were fun, but while Spain and Portugal were out conquering and exploiting, you know, native labor and creating slaves and, you know, mining gold and doing all this stuff and controlling the New World. But this defeat starts to allow Britain to do some big things on the world stage. Okay, now let's just talk a little bit more about how these political institutions are developing. So, when the Normans come in 1066, they continue that tradition of the King's Council that the Anglo-Saxons had initially devised. They call it the Curia Regis, which is essentially just the King's Council. And they establish a couple of innovations. One is they create some sitting ministers, and then they create a second assembly, which is of all the major landholders. So you have the king's ministers who sit, and they have their own club, and then there's a club of people that own lots of land. And this starts to differentiate a bit between two different kinds of interests, the government interests and then the landholder interests. And they also start to expand the Curia Regis's interest in other aspects of state affairs that the monarchy had previously controlled. So they're interested not only in legislative, and recommending laws and recommending taxes, but they're interested in enforcing laws and interpreting laws. And this is going to create some tension with the king once in a while. In British political history, there's a lot of celebration of this particular moment in 1215, where the Magna Carta is signed. And this is celebrated in Britain as one of the earliest documents asserting the rights of citizens versus government. And it's been reinterpreted over time in ways that probably make it look better than it really was. It didn't really have a strong concept of citizen and didn't have a concept of the average person, but it did create specific rights for elites and heavily propertied landholders. And it also directly limited the monarch's authority over the church, which created an independent source of authority the government can fully control, and over taxation. And this is going to be one of the huge themes in British political development, is that monarchs need to tax, okay? So let's just think about this for a minute. If you are a British monarch, why would you need to tax people? What do you want to do that requires money? Like build boats, conquer. Crowns are very expensive, okay? But you're fighting constantly in wars with France. You're going to lose those wars with France unless you have sufficient money to pay for your military, right? So all this political adventurism, and then later on, right, once we get into the 15th and 16th centuries, this exploration, building boats and getting out, requires a ton of cash. And so they're very interested in taxing. And the political institutions are really interested in providing counsel and pushing back on that. And the Magna Carta gives them power to do that. So the Magna Carta establishes what's known as the Council of Barons that take on more legislative powers. And so when people celebrate the Magna Carta, they are essentially celebrating the first big successful attempt to get the king to sign a document that effectively limits his powers. And it largely holds. And it creates, by the 1300s, something known as a parliament, which means a speaking assembly. You know, in French, for example, you know, parler is to speak. So you get this speaking assembly that begins to meet on its own and starts to say, we've got different kinds of interests in our speaking assembly. Some people are elites, and we're going to call them lords, and some people are just more merchants, and we're going to call them commons. And they start to have these separate assemblies of lords and commons that evolve as early as the 1300s. And when Britain is trying to invade France all the time in the 100 Years' War, the king constantly has to go to Parliament and ask for money. And the Commons eventually decides that because they are primarily merchants and they have a lot of the money, that they are the ones that are going to have a bigger say on taxation. And these are trends that have shaped where we've landed in 2019. Okay. Let's talk about empire for a minute. And this gets to started on some of the things that you've read for today. If you have any questions on how to access that book or couldn't find it or think you might have read the wrong stuff, please see me after class. I'm happy to help with that. All right, early experiments. Remember that in 1604, Britain is beating Spain, right? They've been fighting Spain for about 15, 20 years on the open ocean. And they finally are coming to the place where they're going to beat Spain, and this allows them to go try some stuff without Spain intervening. And their earliest experiments, they just try a few things. First off, they're really into spices, like any good foodie would be. But spices are the big thing. And so they're interested in trying to find and locate spices. And they found a private company called the East India Company in 1600. And it's going to take a while to get off and have much success because spices are really, really far away. There are all kinds of potential pirates and other things that are going to get your spices before they get back to you. But they decide we're interested in East India, which is Indonesia, India, Spice Islands, those kinds of places. And that company is going to start exploring east. And then you get some companies, and these are known as chartered companies because they are designed to make a profit, that start exploring west into the Spanish realm. You have one that goes and settles in Newfoundland, which is the far eastern part of the North American continent, up in northern Canada, which has amazing cod. And they decided to establish a fishing colony up there, try to get cod and salt it, and bring it back to Europe, make a lot of money with that. Then there is a Virginia settlement, 1607, the Virginia colony, which is in Chesapeake Bay, Jamestown. Somebody been to Jamestown? Pretty cool, isn't it? They had a kind of a rough few years there, like lots of cannibalism and like Indian wars, and I don't know, morale was not that high. But eventually, enough people stuck around that they finally discovered that they could grow tobacco. And it just happened to be at the same time as like smoking became cool in Europe. And so you discover the ability to grow tobacco at the same time as everyone wants to smoke tobacco. And Virginia suddenly becomes very valuable, and it's taken over, essentially the company's taken over out of bankruptcy by the state, and they start to build tobacco plantations there. Massachusetts Bay is an early experiment, 1620. This is largely an experiment led by Calvinists who have been persecuted religiously. They're Puritans who feel like no one really gets them. They just want to live like an ultra austere life and believe things that no one else around them believes. And so they flee and land in Massachusetts and figure out how to get corn from the Indians and stuff. And they start to develop a colony. It's pretty hard at first as well, but that one is successful. In the Caribbean, Barbados is the first one, 1627. They tried to farm tobacco there, but tobacco is not as good as in Virginia, so they try something new, and they discover sugar cane works really well. And they create a sugar plantation in Barbados, and they start shipping like French captives from the 100 Years' War. They start shipping prisoners, so they start shipping indentured servants to go and work on the sugar plantations, and they're just not that good at it. But they do it anyway, and the Barbados is full of malaria and stuff, and people are dying. But they try to do that. And then the big one, which we're not going to talk too much about, but it becomes a real sore spot in British history, is that they start to settle massively in Ireland. Okay, so Ireland is very Catholic. It's considered to be backward and uncivilized, and you have British settlers that move into Ireland, and over 100,000 of them that move in to settle and to try to preach Protestantism and to convert the barbarian Irish. Okay, so here's some interesting ones at the beginning, and this creates an incentive now for Britain to get involved in the slave trade, because they cannot supply the labor for all of these great tobacco and sugar plantations that are making them so much money with just the captured prisoner indentured servant white guys that keep dying. And so they found what is known as the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company is designed to go to Africa and to meet with tribal leaders in Africa and to sell them goods in exchange for slaves. So African leaders would raid the interior, capture slaves from warring tribes, come down to the coast, trade those goods for weapons and other things with the British. And the British just established what becomes known as a slave triangle, where they bring goods to Africa to trade with these African tribespeople who are selling them slaves. They take those slaves, they take them down to the Caribbean, and they sell them at a major profit to work in the sugar and tobacco plantations. Then they go up to North America, to Virginia, pick up some more stuff, and then head back to Britain and exchange all of these commodities, and then make it back down to Africa. And for anybody who has had a chance to study the slave trade, it was brutal and horrific, and huge numbers of people died in the most inhumane ways in cargo holds on the way to the New World, and if they made it to the New World, it just didn't get a whole lot better because you were a slave for the rest of your life. And this became a challenge for Britain because Britain had strong economic interests to do this, but it also had this strong moralistic tradition of Christian evangelism and of human rights and of the ability to think about how do we restrain our monarch and how do we guarantee rights, and a lot of that required ideas about human liberty and those kinds of ideas. And so those two things are going to be in conflict in the British Empire for some time. Short story is that after a while, Britain's going to be one of the earliest countries to abandon the slave trade and to declare it illegal, because you have anti-slavery campaigners that do a really fine job in Britain, and it becomes banned. Slavery becomes banned in Britain long before it becomes banned in the United States. But this becomes a huge moral dilemma for the British Empire. All right, a couple more things, and then we'll turn to just a bit of a discussion before we close up. I'd like you to understand that there was an English Civil War, and the English Civil War had some important political outcomes. We're now entering the 17th century. The Tudor dynasty falls, and you get a new dynasty that is named the Stuart dynasty, that is marked by King. Yeah, Stuart, you like this one? Yeah. You're in the process of establishing your own, I'm sure. King James of Scotland comes down and takes power in England and establishes the Stuart dynasty, which lasts for more than 100 years. And over the course of this dynasty, you get a massive fight in Britain, which becomes known as the English Civil War. King Charles I, one of the Stuarts, is executed, and it leads to an attempt to create a republican government in Britain. We saw from our presentation today that there's still an attempt by 20% of Britons to do that today. But they essentially decided they were going to abolish the monarchy. And this is a spoiler, the monarchy comes back. Okay, it does not remain permanently abolished. But it comes back after a long civil war. And the Civil War, to sum it up very briefly, is it's a war between the king and his supporters, who are known as the royalists, and supporters of Parliament, who think that the king has too much power. And what's so remarkable here is that these parliamentary supporters are able to bring together a bunch of knights and develop a formidable military force that is able to effectively challenge all of the military force that the king can muster. And it becomes kind of a stalemate where the king cannot ultimately repress the rebels. And it only ends after the king is restored and signs a document that says, all right, Parliament, I will not govern without your consent. So the English Civil War is the period of time where we get the norm that the monarch cannot govern on his own. That Parliament has to consent to any laws that the king is trying to enforce. And shortly after this, you get a second political development called the Glorious Revolution. We ended up with a Catholic king, and many people didn't want a Catholic king. And so William of Orange of the Netherlands attacks Britain, kind of invited by some Protestants of Britain to come in and attack, and takes over. And I'm sure he's the one that named it the Glorious Revolution, right? And restores the Protestant monarchy. But that monarchy is forced to accept the Declaration of Rights and gives Parliament now control over making laws. So now we're toward the end of the 17th century, and we have a parliament that has evolved. Now we've seen it evolve over the course of 800 years or so, to the point where it just gains more and more power, and the king becomes more and more restricted. This, is what's happening when we have North American English colonists, right, in the eastern seaboard of the United States, and they're watching these political developments, and it becomes extremely important for American political thought to see, what's happening in Britain, and why are people becoming, are having the courage to challenge the monarchy. And it becomes critical to the way we think about it when we end up in revolt and independence. Okay, last slide. This has been a lot of information. Last slide, and then I have a couple questions for you. Okay, the context here is that the colonial role of Spain and Portugal are starting to fade, and Britain has new rivals on the open ocean. Does anybody know who they are? Two big rivals, like the ones that keep British monarchs up at night. The Dutch and the French. Okay. And you might not think of the Dutch as like amazing global power, but they were. And why is that? What did the Dutch have that made them so amazing?
Indonesia.
Yeah. They had conquered and taken over through the Dutch East India Company what is now known as the country of Indonesia. And this is where all of your favorite spices come from. And they had established control over all these spice islands, and it had made them extremely wealthy. And they used that wealth to build up a giant navy to protect it. And France is also building up a giant navy too. And it becomes an arms race now between the British, the French, and the Dutch. And one concept that I'd like you to understand is metropole. Okay? Each of these colonies has a metropole. And metropole just means essentially the capital city that directs the colonial enterprise. And so in the British Empire, the metropole is always going to be London. In the French Empire, it's Paris, and in Amsterdam, and in the Dutch Republic, it's Amsterdam. And the relationship between the metropole and its colonies becomes one of wealth creation in many of these cases, and sometimes it becomes one of directing settlement activities abroad. We're going to see the development of two different types of colonies. One is called a settler colony. Settler colony is where you actually get people to go out and try to live there. And the other one is much more just a trading colony where you might establish a military outpost but you use that military outpost to maintain control to support your trade, or maybe you send missionaries out who are determined to convert the tribes to Christianity, and that also happens in trading colonies. At the end of this period, in 1649, you end up getting, at the end of this British Civil War, English Civil War, you get what's known as the establishment of the Commonwealth. That's still a term that's used today. And the Commonwealth is a contract, a social contract between the king and his people, and his peoples that are out beyond in other colonies. And once you get that end of the English Civil War, you get this massive push for imperial expansion, right, in the mid-1600s, where the government determines that we have to win this arms race against France and the Dutch. And that we are going to devote as much energy as we can into really pushing to build the biggest navy that we can to get out there. And they calculate that they can pay for this themselves, ultimately, by controlling trade networks. This was not a free trade era. This was an era where Britain would hire pirates to go out and raid other countries' ships to discourage them from trading, and would do everything it could to lock down the tobacco market, to lock down the sugar market, to lock down the slave market, and use its military force to control those markets. So you've got warships that were essentially created to escort trading vessels during this period of time, because Britain developed a theory that they would win the global military competition by controlling world trade. And so that was the big push in the 17th century. One of these instances that your book refers to that I wanted to highlight was this decision by the British to invade Jamaica. In 1655, Jamaica was a Spanish colony, and it became a test case to see if Spain would actually be able to defend itself, and it was not. And so once Jamaica fell, it was like free raid on Spanish colonies, and they start taking over other parts of the Caribbean. Plus, Jamaica was an amazing place to grow sugar, and they brought in African slaves like crazy to Jamaica and built out the sugar plantation. Okay, the key point that I'm trying to get you to think about as we talk about the development of the British Empire is that this is not, the effects of this are not confined to Britain. Right? This shapes world history in remarkable ways. It shapes the migration of peoples, shapes the flow of languages around the world, it shapes the flow of agriculture around the world, it shapes the flow of technology around the world. And so what we're starting to see as early as the 17th century is that the world is never ever going to be the same again because of what's happening in Britain. And I think that there's probably a link between the political developments that are creating restrictions on the monarch, right, and providing new counsel and new checks and balances on the monarch that are enabling this kind of private commerce and this kind of international strategy that monarchs by themselves may not have been able to pull off without that rich interaction between society and the private sector, business people and their interests, and the monarchy's interests. Okay, we just got a few more minutes. Let me ask how you're feeling about the reading from James. What are you finding from the reading today that you found particularly interesting and helpful in understanding the origins of the British Empire? Yeah.
Interesting.
Tell me your name again.
Oh, Candace.
Candace, thanks.
It seemed like lots of times they were able to just kind of edge out France other places because they were just better organized than anyone else. Like they were just kind of able to, like their tax system, that they always had a steady supply of income, that they kind of had things figured out so they could move quickly. So they were just like better organized than anyone else and just gave them a huge competitive advantage.
Better organized just because they were better, like more organized personalities? What was it? What enabled them to be better organized?
That they had the system where like, so like in France, they had their different estates, right, where like the clergy and noblemen wouldn't be taxed at all, and so they were just trying to take money from the poorest people, but in England, it was like, everyone kind of contributing a little bit, it was just a little bit more evenly spread out than it was in France. The parliament could control the taxes a little better than like the French king could, so they just had money to do stuff with that France didn't have.
All right. So when you say better organized, what I think of is better institutions, right? And this is, it's going to be hard not to, for me to do political science things once in a while. But a political science answer to this is that it's not like they were just like better making lists, right? It was that their institutions had evolved in ways that gave them a competitive advantage. And that's why Britain's institutions are so interesting to us, is because they really enable all of this stuff to happen that gives Britain enormous power. Yeah. So the way society and state interact, I think, is part of that. Yeah. Other things you picked up that you thought were interesting? Yeah.
I thought it was interesting how reliant the British Empire was on the colonies through mercantilism to fund all these wars and this arms race with France. And yes, they had the better institutions where you could do like essentially government bonds and stuff, but they were also extremely dependent on all the natural resources coming in from their colonies, which ultimately led to us kind of getting fed up with it and fighting them off.
Yeah, so the colonies were really, really helpful in stressful times, right? Because you can extract from those colonies. You can extract goods, you can extract taxes, you can extract labor, and they're going to do that all the time. They're going to do that, you know, in the French wars, right, which makes Americans pretty mad. They're going to do that in World War I, which makes some of their colonies really mad. They're going to do that in World War II, which makes the rest of their colonies really mad. And so, yeah, this is a constant challenge. It's a huge asset for you, but you can only extract so much without endangering the very foundations of your empire. Yeah. Other comments? Yes?
I just always thought it was interesting the way that the first colonies were established and kind of the propaganda that was put out from the very earliest of these colonies organization, and exaggerating all of the goods and the bounty that were in these places, just so they could get tons of people to come over. And then later, just like the indentured service. I was trying to look up the numbers, I can't remember though, that you basically were a servant for a certain amount of time, and then if you fulfilled that time allotment, you were given like 100 acres of land. Mm-hmm. And just all of the, yeah. I thought that was.
Would you have done that? Would you have taken the deal?
Heck no, no.
You're spoiled.
Yep.
I would go.
I'm just banking on being part of royalty or something.
Some people took it, right, because they had no other options, right? This was a period for many people of very, very few options. That's why you would sell part of your life away to get a small chance of owning something yourself or being able to make it on your own later in life. It became very hard to get married and have a family and do all the kinds of things you want to do at home if you were in poverty, and this created an opportunity. It wasn't always a great opportunity, but sometimes it would turn out, and sometimes people got very, very rich. The question I'd like you to think about between now and next Monday is the following. Why did Britain take over the world? Because it does. We learned that early in our presentations today, that the sun never sets in the British Empire. It becomes the biggest empire. It outmaneuvers France, it outmaneuvers everybody else. And by the time we're done with our class on Monday, you're going to be amazed at how Britain has taken over the world. But you need to understand that it's just a few million people on a little island with dismal weather, right, with no natural resources. And that's a really interesting puzzle that I'm going to ask you to help me try to solve next Monday. Thank you for your time. Watch the video. Make sure Jordan gets the link.
right, Jordan. Let's see if we can get you in there. So, if you go to you can just like Google BYU Study Abroad or something. Just go to the Kennedy Center's page. And go to for faculty right there. Let's see if this works. Try the faculty login. So switch this to summer.
Okay. Not really though.
2019. Yeah. And then if you click on here, I'm hoping that it'll feel like you have rights.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, here you are.
Okay.
And
oh wow.
just and this is like total perfect territory because you've got like pretty much everybody's lives. Everything you put in, you can see of theirs. So if you go down to you, for instance, let's just look at you.
Yes. Bye.
Rachel out here.
Here I am.
Here you are. Okay, and you say okay, and it'll show you kind of what we see for you.
Okay,
so, this is what I want you to look at. So if you kind of scroll down, you can see you've got your passport entered.
Yep.
But probably 70% of the class doesn't. And then you don't have a travel itinerary in.
And I should have asked how to put that in because I got this like a while ago and just trying to put it in.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get it to work, but.
Okay, and I'm not sure either.
Because there wasn't a way I could like click on it, and then I went to like change stuff, and it was just like personal information. So I might just be doing it wrong too.
Well, so maybe to start with, if you could just, I'll send an email out, or maybe you could remind me to invite everyone to put in their passport stuff. But let's